Thank you for joining us. I am here with Charlie, one of our church members. You're not supposed to have favorites, but he is probably top 5. I don't know.
I appreciate it.
I'll do my rankings off camera later. And Dr. Justin Smith, as always, it's a blessing to be with you guys. We are continuing our study in the book of James. I would highly recommend going back and watching, if you didn't, our first look at the book of James, which we aired last week, and it was just a great introduction to this book, and it's just a fascinating book that is short but packs a great punch. I really appreciated what Charlie had to say about it. I think it's a good way of viewing it, that it is like the kids going off to college and you give all this wisdom and there's all this stuff like, oh, remember this and this and this and this. And I think from the very get-go, we see that in the book of James, because oftentimes as you read the scriptures, there are headers on your passages, and just sorry to disturb you, but those weren't original. It was just letters. So sorry, I know it's very shocking.
Groundbreaking stuff.
These headers help us understand, but it's interesting that there's these headlines probably in your Bible that you'd be reading in the book of James, but I don't even think they do necessarily. It's almost impossible, because you'd have to go almost verse by verse, because James is, it's the shotgun approach, just this idea, this idea, this idea, this idea, and there's a lot for us to think about and discuss. So let me just go ahead and hop right in, starting in verse 2, and I'll go ahead and read through verse 8 as we begin this discussion. Consider it pure joy whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. The person who should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. So it's very fascinating to me that there's about 4 different ideas that are brought up immediately, just going all over the place. Consider it pure joy when you face trials of any kind. From the very get-go, that is medicine that is hard to swallow, I think. For us, the trials and things that we would face, but for the people who would have first been hearing this, and you just imagine this letter being dispersed and being read aloud to these small gatherings of Christians who wouldn't even have called themselves Christians at this point, and they were just trying to figure out exactly what it is that they were doing. And these are people who are seeing friends who die for the faith. It is widely accepted that the writer of this, James, is martyred for his faith shortly after writing this. And so this is something that is tough to take. Consider it pure joy that y'all might die tomorrow for this. And that's tough, because I know for me, my adversity isn't anywhere near that, and I still struggle with it. And it's something that's still hard to understand. But what do you guys think about that concept? That's what James launches into to a group of people who are facing death.
Man, yeah, no, I read it and I'm like, It's almost when people are like, if you're going through a bad time, it's gonna be okay, is more our mellowed down version. But it's so interesting to hear this, and this is a very a mentality that you hear a lot in the church, especially, and it's probably from here. But it's just so interesting to me, because I'm just it's just not at all. It was counter to the thinking at the time, I'm assuming. No one wants to be brutally murdered over anything. And here they're like, hey, yeah, it's the test. It's testing your faith. I don't know. This is a very interesting thing, because I've never really agreed with this idea. Being I think it's a dangerous mentality. In a lot of situations where it's I get where you're coming for, and I know that now it leads to it makes sense. There's a lot of martyred people, but the idea of your faith being tested to this degree where you're being asked to die and do all these things. It's yes, we have a big, huge sacrificial part of our church, But it's very strange for us, especially as humanity. Like most of us have the will to live. We joined this specific religion because most of us were tempted by the idea of having everlasting life. So our will to live is so strong that we don't want to do it. And then we have these messages that are also like, but like also you must be willing to give it up at a moment's notice for the faith. And that is like a kind of sacrificial living that is like so difficult to get a grasp on. And I'm like really admiring of somebody who can do that. But it's like opposite of self-preservation. It's so strange. It's like opposite of nature or human nature anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's always hard to wrap our minds around, and I think it's always hard to talk about suffering in a way that doesn't feel sort of placating. But perhaps the idea is suffering with meaning makes suffering more palatable, I suppose. And I don't even know if I want to use that language exactly, but I think for most of us, some sort of sacrifice, some sort of suffering, some sort of difficulty is something that we would be willing to go through if there's a meaning to it, right? That this is part of something bigger. I'm working for something, I'm working within something that is bigger than me. It's when we have those moments of suffering, right, or pain, or trial, or difficulty that we see detached from some larger meta-narrative, detached from something bigger. That's really hard. I mean, Charlie, you were talking about your work in reading through Job. I mean, that's part of Job's problem, I think. I mean, I don't want to get off into the weeds with Job, but Job has a particular meta-narrative that he's working with, which is good things happen to good people, right? Mm-hmm. Righteous people get blessed by God. And Job is like, I'm righteous. What is going on here? And it's in that process that God reorients Job. I mean, spoiler alert, we get to the end and God says to Job, who are you? Mm-hmm. And that sets the tone, I think, even for where we are with early Christian suffering. This is a Jesus who suffers and dies. This is not a God who suffers for us, but a God who suffers with us, right? Mm-hmm. And so Jesus models that suffering, a suffering with meaning, that James is now drawing us into, that says, when you suffer, when you go through trials, there is a point to it. It doesn't hurt any less, right? Mm. But you're being matured in this process. You're being perfected in this process. And this language is so interesting, that you may be mature and complete, lacking in nothing. So, does it make trials any better? No. Does it make it any less life-threatening, life-altering? No. Is there a point? Yes. And I guess that's the silver lining, is that there's a point, which sometimes offers little comfort, but little comfort, I guess, is better than no comfort.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's helpful. But.
No, and I think this verse specifically will always hold special place in my heart. It was interesting when I was first preaching. It was this small church outside of Abilene, Texas, and it was like 40 minutes outside of Abilene, so that's really the middle of nowhere. If you go look at Abilene on a map, it's the middle of nowhere. I was in grad school, and I was preaching for this little church, and I was preparing my sermon for the week, and it was on James 1:2, just consider it pure joy when you face trials of any kind. And I had lived a pretty blessed life to that point, and I remember having the thought, I wish I had a trial to talk about. I thought that in my head because I was preparing the sermon on that, and that was in the week ahead going up to that sermon, and then I found out on Friday that my parents were getting divorced, and it was just one of those, and I had planned this out weeks before that I was going to be talking about that passage, and that church really surrounded me and loved me through that, and it was one of the most profound moments of my faith. They shared stories about their own similar experiences and rallied around me, and I'm always, like, when I get around this passage, it's very meaningful to me because of that moment and that experience. But I think it's hard then when you go through those trials or those difficult things again to just accept the perseverance and that sort of shaping, because there's been things that I've encountered since that I would not prefer to go through, but yet I think it's helped me become a better person, and it's helped me to learn some lessons, and I would prefer to learn the lesson another way, but it's important to have that feeling and have that experience, and sometimes to go through that and understand the difficulties of life. I just think it's interesting that James, who is writing this probably in the late 40s to early Christians, it's just slam. It's not let's soften it up, tell a little preacher story at the beginning to get the joke going. No, it's just from the very if you're facing trials, consider it joy. That adversity can produce something in you that almost can't be produced any other way. And I wish that wasn't true. I wish that there was a different way to learn some of these lessons, but I know I'm also thankful for some of the things that I've gone through that I wouldn't wish on somebody else, because of what I've learned in this and the things that I now hopefully am a little bit more mature in my approach to things because of some of the stuff that I've dealt with. And I think it's interesting that is the goal, perseverance. I think our life goal is comfort and making things easier, and when we face resistance, that's when we often give up, and we need a little reframing in that at times, I'd say.
Well, it's interesting here even too, this idea of trial. In the Greek, this idea of trial is to test or learn the true nature of something. So I almost even wonder here, sort of kind of baked into this, is that trials are here to draw out who we really are, to learn who we really are. And so as we're going through this process of being tested, right, of being challenged, as we are learning who we really are in the midst of difficulty, right? Because I think that's when we really learn who we are. When things are easy, our deficiencies, our issues, our problems, our challenges are masked. But when things get difficult, we really start to find out who we are. Who are you when times are hard? And so as we're going through these difficult times, we're finding out who we are, and there's a joy in that, I think, is what James is drawing us into. That there is this process of figuring out who we really are. I mean, and this really, in some ways, it's an odd way to start this, but in another way, it really fits. If as we talked last time, this idea of discipleship is following Jesus, right? It's not what we do, it's who we are. Then this is starting out by saying, we need to find out who we are. And as we're finding out who we are, there's joy in this process as we are moving towards understanding ourselves as mature people. And that can only really happen when we're being tested, right? I mean, it's hard. To use your divorce example, I went through a divorce, and my dad and I were talking about it as I was going through it, and he said something along the lines of, you're learning a lot of things in this, you're learning a lot about yourself. And I think my response to him was, I wish I could have learned this without going through this, right? Couldn't I have learned these things about myself without going through this? Mm-hmm. And the answer is maybe, but the reality is no, probably not. Yeah. Right? You go through it, and in that process, you are forced to understand yourself better. Mm-hmm. And it's the growth that comes through pain, right? Mm-hmm. You might even argue that all growing is painful, right? But it's kind of a hard way to start, as you guys both pointed out. I mean, he jumps right in. There's no waiting into this, right? It's just deep in, no floaties, and it really sort of pushes this conversation in an interesting way.
Yeah, and just jumps right in and says, yeah, this is going to be tough, but
also
good medicine.
So good, because it shows for James, no word is wasted.
Yeah,
it almost feels in the very same way. It's everything that he's saying is I believe this, and I'm putting this out here, even though this is a short letter, it's to the point. Mm-hmm. And I hope that it's resonant in the ways that it resonates in a way that maybe if Paul after doing all his greetings, we'll still get to it. And I think that it is resonant because it gets to the point really quickly, especially for a lot of us who are like, hey, maybe we don't have as much time to sit around and read a Bible passage. So to like just be hit with this, like such a profound idea within like just a sentence or two, and we've been discussing it for like 10 minutes. It's like, it's meaningful.
And it is one of those things, and I think that we can sometimes believe that God is going to lead us to a more comfortable life. And I think for me, something that I've learned over my time in ministry is, now that I'm like kind of an old preacher, I guess. I used to be the young one, but now I'm a little bit older. So I used to think like, once this problem is solved within the congregation, then like we'll be in kind of the green pastures, and then there's always something else, and so there's always something to be going on, and that's one of the things that I think is really profound about having a community around you, is you're always celebrating, but also always mourning. Like there's always somebody to reach out to because he or she has something really hard that's happened to them, but there's also like the chance to celebrate. Like, it's so awesome that happened, or such a blessing. And so like that's one of the powerful parts about being in community, is like we all are going to experience times of suffering personally, and then communally we're always experiencing it all the time basically. And so there's something so powerful in being in this type of relationship, that you are never like that far from those who are suffering and going through some hard times, and being part of those hard conversations, and being like Job's friends, but hopefully better versions who don't just give bad advice, but who walk alongside and learn to say nothing. I mean, that's what I've learned is when I go into hospital rooms or spaces when a death has happened or something, just to get a really bad diagnosis, they don't want me to say anything. It's more about presence than it is about, there's no magic formula. And even like, let me bring up the book of James. That's not what you're supposed to do either. You're supposed to sit with it and wrestle together. And that's what makes this, as this idea continues, a little bit tough for me, because I think there's always going to be that wrestling with faith. And he's writing this again to people who are being persecuted for their faith, and he's going to be martyred in just a little bit. And he says, don't doubt, basically. And I struggle with that, and we were talking off camera a little bit about this, Justin, because this to me is just an odd idea, and why I believe it's so important to take the whole of Scripture. We never just want to be people who read one book and stick with one idea and just that's it, because James is pretty harsh on doubters here, and I think is saying like don't be wishy-washy basically. But then the book of Jude says be merciful to those who doubt, and we confirmed it is the same word. So be merciful to those who doubt, and don't doubt at all. And then I think about Jesus when he shows up to the person that we call Doubting Thomas, and it's interesting because Doubting Thomas ends up with the most profound statement of faith of anybody in the Gospels. He says, "My Lord and my God." So it's the most profound statement of faith is this person that we have labeled Doubting Thomas. And if I'm Jesus, I'm like, look at me, I'm back from the grave, like. And no, he says, no, here's my hands. I'll let you explore this. And so I get a little bit of what James is saying, but I also need to allow the other scriptures to come into this to think about the whole conversation, that there's just going to be times when we're struggling. We got to raise our hand and say, I have more questions than answers at this point, and I don't know what's going on right now. And I think it's important to remember that it's not, James just doesn't have the final word on this.
Yeah. Well, not to wrangle this too much, but I wonder at times if there's some differentiation that we need to make, right, between questioning, doubting, and wavering. Mm-hmm. So I think one of the challenges that I continue to see as a professor with students who come to me and have been taught their whole lives not to question, that asking questions or questioning means that you're a bad Christian. It means you lack faith. And I always respond, the best Christians ask the best questions. So asking good questions, sitting in this uncomfortable space and saying, I have more questions than answers, I don't think is a bad thing. Doubting, to me, maybe takes us in a different direction. And if we think about James and we think about Jude and we think about Thomas, the thing that always draws me together with this question of doubting is experience. What we've seen, what we've experienced. And Peter's a great example of this, right? You know, that really famous story, Jesus is walking on the water, it's stormy, Peter gets out, he walks on the water. Why? He's focused on Jesus, he knows what can be done, it's being done, and then he starts to look around, and then he starts to waver, and then he starts to sink. It's because he's allowing that to take place of the experience he's currently had. Thomas, why do you doubt? You've seen Jesus, you've spent 1 to 3 years with him. All of the other people that you've spent this intimate amount of time with have seen and experienced the risen Jesus, and you go, until I see with my own eyes, I won't believe. But you have this experience, right? This whole experience that you draw in on. James, I think, is writing to early Christian communities and saying, you've experienced this stuff. You've experienced us as eyewitnesses. You've been a part of this process. Lean into what you have experienced. Mm-hmm. And maybe Jude, writing much later, is a little bit softer. Because maybe he's now saying, kind of in between the lines, I know you haven't had the experiences that others had. Mm-hmm. And some of you who are doubting are in this space because you don't have that long-term experience. You haven't seen what we've seen. You haven't heard what we've heard. So let's be gentle with some of them. And maybe it's just personality. Maybe James is he's just spicy. Maybe he's just hot. And he's saying, listen, you know, this doubting stuff, we're not here for this. And Jude is saying, well, but people are still going to be wrestling with this, and how do we treat them? So it's not so far-fetched even to think that we have two different writers just having a different heart or a different experience or a different approach to doubt. But doubt and experience to me always seem to go hand in hand, you know. Mm-hmm. That wavering kind of thing seems to go with what your experience has been versus sort of what you're allowing to override that experience. Mm-hmm. And that could be the challenge, I think.
Yeah, and especially as you're dealing with adversity. James, it continues, a few more verses. Again, we could go on and on about a lot of these, but believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position, which is another, that is more Proverbs. But the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wild flower. For the sun rises with scorching heat and withers the plant. Its blossom falls and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich will fade away even while they go about their business. This is a fascinating idea. If you are watching this, it's likely that you are in the top 10% of the world's wealth, probably towards the top of that. And I just find it interesting to think about this idea. Again, James is bringing up these really important concepts, like that if you're poor, celebrate it. And if you're rich, think of it as humiliation.
It's like, what in the Dr. Seuss is going on here?
Yeah.
I mean, it is really interesting because it's like, these are like things that we have heard before. Like, this is like almost like just a take on the Beatitudes, right? Like, blessed are the poor. For they'll inherit the kingdom of heaven. I think that was it. And like, it's there. It's just interesting, like, in the language that James chooses, just seems to, like, just by modifying just his sentences, it's like, oh, it like hits differently, being like, why am I insulted by this now? But it also is making me pay attention a little bit more, which is like interesting in a way, especially how we like opened up the discussion about being like the second verse being like, I mean, like, be used to these trials and like you're gonna learn something more. It's like sometimes it takes harsh words for you to learn something or to hear it differently. Yeah. And like you can definitely see it in how he's speaking. And it's weird because I don't actually see this as more or less spicy than how Paul talks to us, because Paul will be like, is that it? No, that's the wrong answer. And he's just like, I'm just telling it what it is. Like, let's move on. Next. I don't feel like I need to expand on it. I think you know. And I appreciate like having an author just assume the knowledge that we have, and as opposed to like speaking down in any way. It's just like, here it is. I'm assuming that you've come to the table with some background information, and like speaking to like an educated audience. So I appreciate that. But yeah, it's very like the idea of like especially the section where it's talking about the rich being humiliated, or like being humbled is what my version says, but I'm sure you have something to say about that. I think it's interesting in the way to just look at the context of like what the entire Bible says about like, oh yeah, like everything will pass away. I'm sure this is very similar to things that have been said in Ecclesiastes, and some proverbs talk about like, yeah, like it even, the imagery makes me think of that. I don't remember what passage it is, but they talk about like, don't worry about tomorrow.
Jesus, yeah.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
Jesus, quoting Jesus.
The answer's always Jesus.
But it's like, you're like, don't worry about tomorrow. Like, we dress the flowers, and it's gonna die tomorrow. So like, don't worry about what you're gonna wear. Don't worry about what you're gonna eat. And for some reason, the same imagery makes me think back to that. So it's not necessarily like 100% negative in my mind. It's like reading in the context of the rest of the passages in the Bible like creates this like whole picture for me. So I don't know if that.
Oh, definitely, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that that's a really biblical idea, but I think it's easy to not have this at the forefront of our minds. I think of the book of Amos, where God says, stop worshiping, basically, because I hate it. Because you all don't actually do anything for poor people, basically. And he calls the women cows, like especially fattened cows, and that's like, whoa, that's a little harsh.
We know that God does not like cows.
Yeah, well,
golden cows.
Yeah, well, yeah, but it's a real harsh word, and I think this is something that we need to have at the forefront of our minds, and we, as the wealthy, we need to think about it. And I think we spoke about Job. I think there's a little Job-like understanding that creeps into all of us, that I'm kind of owed this. I'm owed a good life. I know, Charlie, you work really hard at your job. You work like a lot of hours, and you spend a lot of time, so I'm kind of owed this. I'm owed a promotion. I'm owed this. And there's that mentality that can creep into all of us. And in reality, I think sometimes we need to stop and, especially as a white male, check our privilege and like really just say, man, I'm not responsible for any of this, and all of this is God's. All of it can be taken at any moment. And one of my mentors likes to remind us, that a group of pastors, that we're born on third base and think we hit a triple. And I think there's something in that in all of us, and we need passages like this to hold intention with our lives, to just say, yeah, this is going to lead to your demise if this is all that you think about and all that you focus on, and just like where you put your head and your heart. And it should be your humiliation and not the thing that you take pride in.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting too with James writing this. Here he is, most likely in Jerusalem, a part of the community of shared goods. So when you look at the first 4 or so chapters of Acts, they have taken Jesus' teachings. They have taken what Jesus is saying in Luke especially, and they are modeling it. They are selling everything they have. They are pooling their resources. They are working together. In the ancient world, wealth and poverty is based on a very simple concept, that there's a limited amount of stuff in the world. If you have more, then somebody else has less. And so he's writing to this community, and he's saying, there are those of you in the community that are rich, and you are rich because you have more than you need, which means there are sisters and brothers among you who have less than they need. And there is this reversal that is coming, this brought low, this change in status. It is going to happen. This is part of the kingdom of God. This is part of the end times. So Be aware of what this means. Those of you who are poor now, your status will also be reversed. You will be lifted up, right? The last will be first and the first will be last. This is Jesus 101, right, in his teaching. And James is drawing us right into this, and he's saying to the community, this is what justice looks like. You cannot have social justice without economic justice. You cannot do justice with one another without looking after one another's needs. And these needs are not hypothetical. They are lived needs, right? These are real needs. And so it's this, again, reversal of the expected, which is the wealthy are blessed, the poor are looked down upon by God, or the gods, and cursed. And Jesus has said throughout his ministry that's not the case, and James picks this up, right?
Yeah, and I feel as a pastor, probably the most thankful to be in my role, to feel like I'm participating most in the kingdom of God when our church, and it's happened many times throughout my ministry, when somebody finds out about something that happened in someone's life within our community and just says, hey, they need some financial help right now. And we've had opportunities, and just people can give anonymously to that situation. We are able to cut a check and just give. It is so powerful, and just like, hey, the community knows you need something, and we obviously need to be in enough of a relationship with each other to even know those things, and even that sometimes is not available to us in the ways that we sometimes live distinct lives. But I love it when that happens in our community, and you're right, Justin, that it is the last are first and the first are last, and these things that we know that Jesus says, but I don't think we really like to prioritize them or listen to them. And again, James is just slamming these things and just saying this. There's just really powerful things in almost every sentence of this book that we could spend 30 minutes each talking about each one of them. We will continue in verse 19 in our next study. So we're going to miss a couple of these verses, which also have some really powerful stuff, but we just can't get to it all because it's all so good. But I'm thankful for Charlie joining us again, and Justin. It's always a blessing to dive into God's Word together. If you want to know more about our church, or you want to know more about following Jesus with your life, you can email me, Brian, with a Y, at Glendale.church. We're so thankful that you have joined us for this discussion. And if you're interested, we'll have a time of prayer starting in just a few minutes on Zoom, so you can connect from any part of the world, and we would love to pray with you. Hope you have a fantastic evening.